Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and begin. This is a really joyous occasion for those of us involved with the Murphy Institute. We have here both of the directors. I'm a co-director on behalf of the law school, Gregory Sisk of the Murphy Institute. Dr. David Devil, who is my co-director, is here with us as well. And Michelle Rash, our program director. And the three of us began this discussion about a year ago, wanting to add to the artwork in the law school and to do it in a way that added to the diversity of faces appearing within the building, and also to demonstrate the universality of the Catholic Church. And so we arrived at St. Josephine Bakhita as our first, not the last one, but the first icon to add. And we were delighted to discover that Professor Rachel Paulose is a devotee of St. Josephine. And so she will be making a presentation here in a moment. The icon you can see before you, it's absolutely fantastic. We couldn't be more pleased. And we're fortunate that the artist, Nicholas Markell, who created this icon, will be with us on November 1st. So please put that on your calendar to talk about iconography and the role of that in our faith journey. I'm sure he'll have more to say about this particular one. Maybe he'll have a little hint to give us about the one that's coming next, and talk about that in general. Professor Paulose needs little introduction to those of you who are here with us in the law school, but I'm going to take a moment to say a little bit more because she is such a valued colleague and she is such a perfect person to make the presentation today. Professor Rachel Paulose is a graduate of the Yale Law School. She clerked on the 8th Circuit. She has served in distinguished positions in both public life and in private practice. In particular, when she was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate as the United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, she became the first Indian American woman to hold any federal position that required Senate confirmation. And during her tenure as the United States Attorney, she had several important priorities, one of which was some of the first prosecutions for human trafficking. And she, in fact, that is a course that she teaches for us here at the law school on human trafficking. And St. Josephine, of course, is a major figure with respect to that. So I would like to ask her to join us, to come up to the podium and share some words about St. Josephine. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sisk and Ms. Rash. I'm so grateful for the leadership of the Murphy Institute and for the many invitations that Dr. Sisk and St. Thomas have granted to recognize diverse members of the church. It is a privilege to be part of the law school's first recognition of a person of color, unless you count our Lord, as I do, through the dedication of this beautiful icon. And I am eager, having spent some time studying this remarkable woman, to share why St. Josephine Bakhita is a most worthy honoree in our university. So let me tell you a little bit first about her life story and her biography, because it wasn't so long ago that she walked among us. The woman we know now as St. Josephine was born in 1869 in Darfur, Sudan, in a very happy, prosperous, and free family. We don't actually know her birth name because Arab slave traders kidnapped her when she was still a child of about 7 or 8 and forced her into slavery. They named her, with cruel irony, Bakhita, which means fortunate one. And like so many abducted children, St. Josephine actually forgot her given name, but eventually embraced Bakhita as her own in a foretaste of a life marked by humility and mercy. Her tormentors forced the young child to walk 600 miles barefoot across the desert. She was bought and sold at least twice during that journey alone. And that was only the beginning. For the next decade, St. Josephine was treated as property, bought, sold, and given away 12 times. She was trafficked across 2 continents and several nations. She was beaten, abused, and degraded daily. And I don't want to minimize the horror of slavery. Her first owner forced her to serve his daughters as a maid. After she allegedly broke a vase, she was beaten so viciously that she was bedridden for a month. Years later, St. Josephine would recollect that barely had one wound healed when her enslavers would inflict yet another bruise. She told of one episode, which unfortunately was not unusual, wherein a general's wife ordered her marked for life. The general's wife watched while another woman cut St. Josephine's skin and then rubbed the bleeding wounds with salt to make the scars permanent. This particular episode of torture left 114 scars on her body. Indeed, as she lay in her final sickness late in her life, her mind flashed back to those cruel years of bondage, and she cried out in delirium, "Lord, please loosen the chains, they are heavy." In 1883, Callisto Legnani, the Italian consul in Sudan, bought St. Josephine, eventually took her along with him to Italy, and then gifted her to his friend named Augusto Michaeli. Bakhita was forced to care for Michaeli's young son, whom she escorted to school, among other caretaking roles. Now, providentially, the boys' school was operated by the Canasian sisters. While the Michaeli family planned a visit back home, the Michaeli lady of the house took St. Josephine to the convent for what she intended as a brief stay. And St. Josephine was placed with the Institute for Academicians run by the Canasian sisters. And here, a remarkable thing happened. St. Josephine encountered Jesus for the first time in her life. She became convinced of the truth of Christianity, and she freely adopted the faith. This momentous decision changed the course of her destiny. When the Michaelis returned from Africa and demanded that Josephine accompany them back home, the future saint, with God's help at last, found her voice. She refused to leave the sisters, the only family she had known since she was a little girl. The Canasian sisters eventually helped her file suit in Italian courts for her freedom, and the Patriarch of Venice, also a Catholic, personally pleaded for Josephine's freedom. And ultimately, for those of you who are aspiring lawyers, the good news is that it was the influence of the law, in addition to the work of God, that loosed her bonds. Italian courts declared Josephine free based on the fact that slavery had been illegal in both Sudan and Italy for years. At this point, Josephine decided to formalize her commitment as a Catholic. The church baptized and confirmed her as Josephine Margaret Maria Bakhita in 1890. And in 1896, St. Josephine took her vows as a Canasian daughter of charity. She forgave her captors and committed herself to a life of service to God. Her only references to her oppressors were to encourage others to pray for those who do not know the Lord. Her eyes were fixed on Jesus, and her capacity for forgiveness was remarkable. St. Josephine worked at the Canasian Sisters Convent in Schio, Italy for over 50 years, cooking, sewing, welcoming visitors. In the town of Schio, in that convent, St. Josephine was known as the nun who was happy to meet newcomers, to bless the children who sought her comfort, and to pray for the townspeople. She had lost her biological family forever, but she was embraced wholeheartedly by the church and by the town she so faithfully served. Indeed, during World War II, it's hard to believe that this was happening so close in time. The townspeople pleaded for St. Josephine's prayers and for the intervention of God for protection. Not a single person in that village perished during the war, and the townspeople credited St. Josephine in what was the first of many miracles based on her intervention with the Lord. During her later years, St. Josephine was stricken often with sickness, perhaps as a result of the cruel treatment that her body had endured during many years of slavery, but she remained a beacon of hope for those around her. After one particularly long incident, St. Josephine died on February 8th, 1947, surrounded by her sisters. Observers believed she was welcomed to the heavenly kingdom by the Blessed Mother herself, because St. Joseph's last words were, "Our Lady, Our Lady." The Catholic Church began the canonization process in 1958. Pope John Paul II declared her venerable in 1978, and the church canonized St. Josephine on October 1st, 2000. So we know St. Josephine today as the patron saint of human trafficking victims and the patron saint of Sudan. Her annual feast day is February 8th, and on this day, Christians are encouraged to pray for those hurt by slavery and human trafficking. We're reminded to intercede for those who are trying to end this crime and the many who help victims to overcome their suffering. And we are encouraged to take action to end the injustice of human exploitation. The story of St. Josephine, I think in so many ways, is the story of God's call on a very unlikely heroine. For not the first time, the Lord chose to use a vessel whom the world had overlooked. Her captors, her alleged masters, all the powers of the day saw nothing of the true worth of St. Josephine. And she herself found no earthly fame during the course of her very long life. But we may all be thankful that St. Josephine saw in herself the true worth of any person, which is a life made in the image of God. When she awakened to the value of her own soul, St. Josephine rose up to the call that God had placed on her life. She did not seek fame, she simply remained faithful. What she hungered for more than anything else was a personal relationship with God. Actually, when her captors demanded that she leave Italy, she said, "I can't leave this place because I don't want to lose God." The only thing that she lost in that devotion to Christ, and thus her devotion to the country where she found freedom, were her chains. In doing so, she became an inspiration to millions of people around the world who think of this extraordinary woman every time we think of the evil of slavery and the power of God's redemptive love. I can't help but think that God saw in St. Josephine the same desire that drew Isaiah to him, who famously told God, "Here I am, send me." I wonder if the Lord saw in St. Josephine the same spirit of forgiveness that marked the life and career of Joseph, who suffered greatly but became the rescuer of two nations in their hour of greatest need. I ponder if God felt in St. Josephine's desire to simply be with God's people the same devotion that marked Mary Magdalene, a woman who was just happy to follow Jesus along with his disciples and provide for their needs. St. Josephine's life is a reminder that God answers those who simply seek him. But her life and legacy also illustrate the universality of human suffering through time, beyond oceans, and across cultures. Sadly, St. Josephine's story is as relevant today as it ever was. Human trafficking remains a plague on humanity. Human trafficking claims about 25 million victims, the majority of whom are trafficked for labor. It is a $150 billion industry. The only industry that is more lucrative is drug trafficking. Human trafficking targets women in particular. Women make up the overwhelming majority of victims, about 70%, and children make up about a quarter of those trafficked globally every year. Despite the high number of cases, the Department of Justice prosecution numbers remain under about 500 prosecutions a year. And the presence of this icon in this school, in this city, should also remind us that human trafficking remains a plague in Minnesota. In Minnesota, the average age of a victim is 13. About 40% of human trafficking victims in Minnesota are children. Minnesota is in the top 5 nationally of US states for the numbers of people human trafficking. That's a top 5 list that we don't ever want to make. And Minneapolis and St. Paul are in the top 15 for US metropolitan areas for child sex trafficking. Why are some of the reasons that this is so? Well, some of the reasons are because Minnesota has unique vulnerabilities that other states don't have that make it a target for human trafficking. We share the largest, longest, largely unmanned border with Canada. Our airport is one of the 20 busiest in the United States. Our Duluth Superior Port is the largest freshwater port in the world. We have a varied and economically disadvantaged ethnic minority population, and we are number 2 for online solicitations for human trafficking. So we could ask ourselves, how ought we to respond to the crisis that seems endemic and nearly unconquerable? I think that in the spirit of Saint Josephine, we ask for God's intervention and do all we can to liberate the enslaved. Saint Josephine admonished her many admirers to pray for those without God, understanding that they were in a slavery of their own because their minds are blinded to truth. What a great grace it is to know God, she said. And she remained aware of both the evil of slavery and the cruelty of humans to each other, but she also determined that her life story would be different. In other words, she determined that she would overcome evil with good. Part of the beauty of this icon and what it reminds us of is the illustration of the universality of the Christian church, especially in this city, so wounded by racial injustice. Saint Josephine's life is a testament to God's care for all of his creation. The church Jesus founded is not just white, not just European, not just Gentile, not just wealthy, not just privileged. Indeed, at its inception, it was none of these things. And yet, its truth is obvious to all people, even from the order of creation. Saint Josephine, as she walked under the open sky in Italy, once said that she had experienced in her heart, without knowing who he was, a creator. She said, seeing the sun, the moon, and the stars, I said to myself, who could be the master of these beautiful things? And I felt a great desire to know him, to serve him, to pay him homage. Saint Josephine understand that we all have a heavenly creator, and thus no man could lay claim to her body. How incredible then that a woman who had experienced so much of the ugliness of this world could still look to the earth and see beauty. Because of that beauty, she believed there must be a God, there must be a creator. And her beatification speaks to the power of a church that remains committed to the salvation of all people, that welcomes the least of these, that serves everyone, everywhere it steps foot, because it sees in every human life a reflection of the one who gives all of us breath. The diversity of the church helps me to understand that I am speaking today to people who, like Saint Josephine, are yourselves survivors of all manner of brutality. For you, I hope Saint Josephine's testimony resonates powerfully even today with the promise of potential. Saint Josephine once said, if I were to meet the slave traders who kidnapped me, and even those who tortured me, I would kneel and kiss their hands, for if that did not happen, I would not be a Christian and religious today. The Lord has loved me so much, we must love everyone. I find the depth of that grace unfathomable. In some ways, it makes me very uncomfortable because my human mind cannot fully embrace wishing well the very people who have planned my demise, especially those who've done so without cause. And part of the reason for my discomfort is that I do not in any way want to justify wickedness. I think for all of us who struggles with what seem like just the never-ending reign of evil in this world, obedience to God's extraordinary demands on our life can be a struggle. And still, I have the most fervent admiration for a woman who saw in man's plan for evil, God's plan for good and for his glory. I admire Saint Josephine's trust in the sovereignty of God It is a model of obedience that led her out of slavery and on the road to sainthood. Almost 3 years ago, my longtime mentor, Professor Hank Shea, called me and urged me to leave my partnership with the largest global law firm in the world to come teach at St. Thomas. It's time, he said, to invest in the future. It's time to give to the next generation some of what has been planted in you, to offer yourself, Rachel, for the service of the church. Nothing about what Professor Shea made any worldly sense. And every bone in my body said no to what he was asking me to do. What he didn't know was that I had been praying for a long time that God would use me for a larger platform, for a larger purpose. And I knew in my heart that Professor Shea's counsel was right. I knew that his invitation was God's answer to my prayer, and that God was asking me to simply be obedient. Now, neither Professor Shea nor I could have imagined the trials that lay ahead for me, for my family, for the city of Minneapolis torn apart by racial injustice, for a world immobilized by COVID over the last 2 years. Yet, for not the first or the last time, Professor Shea changed the trajectory of my life and allowed me to see God's work through me and for his people in ways that I couldn't have imagined 3 years ago. As a professor, what I've come to see over the last 2 years is the depth of human depravity, the relentless face of pain, and the despair of good people suffering under the weight of powerful forces of wickedness. And let's be candid. Part of the reason we're honoring Saint Josephine here today is because in this space at this time is because, as diverse as the Catholic Church is, we Christians have not always done right by our brothers and sisters of color. We have not always treated with respect women who are due equal dignity. So when Derek Chauvin choked the life out of George Floyd, set our city on fire, and caused the world to question how a police officer could murder an American citizen in broad daylight on a public sidewalk, we in the Academy ask ourselves, again, how do Christians respond in the face of such injustice? I think the answer that Jesus gave is that we love God and we love our neighbors as ourselves. That starts with honoring God and seeing our neighbors, truly seeing their dignity and their equal worth. So now, every time a visitor comes to this space in this law school, she will see for the first time a woman of color, an African woman that God used powerfully and is still using to fight against slavery. As a Christian, what I've come to see over the last 2 years is how desperately the world needs more St. Josephines, the kind of people who see beauty in the most tragic situations, who choose to forgive the unforgivable, who understand that no hatred in this life compares to the love of God. And again, to be candid, part of the reason that I'm speaking in this space at this time is because of my duty as a Christian woman of color and a member of the Academy. So when I had the privilege of speaking to a global audience alongside the sister of George Floyd, I marveled that Miss Floyd thanked God for using her brother to open the eyes of people around the world to the daily suffering of people of color, and particularly of African Americans. I said later that Mr. Floyd had done in death what none of us could do in life. And I find, again, the depth of the Floyd's family, of their faith and their ability to forgive, their ability to see God in the most evil of situations, unfathomable. But they now walk in the footsteps of this remarkable African woman, St. Josephine. How wonderful it is for us in this city to share these providential connections with St. Josephine. The power of her life and her liberation still speak to us today. I want to say for every person here who has endured bondage, St. Josephine says, God sees you. For every person here today who has survived assault, Saint Josephine says, God will deliver you. For every person here today who's overcome the reproach of those who'd keep you in subjection, Saint Josephine says, God will restore you. And for every person struggling to see your own worth because of what has been done to you, Saint Josephine says, God will not abandon you. The scripture promises that God will redeem the years the locusts have eaten. So please do not yield your hope. Please do not surrender to despair no matter what has been done. Please do not give up on God. There are people here in this space, in this law school, who want to help you overcome any challenge you have in this life. What this icon says and will say to everyone who sees it for all the days to come is that God will reach you wherever you are at, and he will grant you a hope and a future that you could not begin to imagine. From this day on, this icon will remind us in a tangible way to believe in the power of a life entrusted to God as we remember the glorious story of Saint Josephine. So I would like to close with an adapted version of one of the church's novenas to Saint Josephine. Holy Saint Josephine Bakhita, you were sold into slavery as a child and endured untold hardship and suffering. Once liberated from your physical enslavement, you found true redemption in your encounter with Christ and his church. Lord, assist all those who are trapped in a state of slavery. Intercede, O God, on their behalf so that they will be released from their chains of captivity. Those whom man enslaves, let God set free. Provide comfort to survivors of slavery and let them look to you as an example of hope and faith. Help all survivors finding healing from their wounds. We ask for your prayers for those abused among us. Amen. Well, I am happy to take questions on the life of Saint Josephine at this time. And for those of you who'd like to learn more about her, Ignatius Press has a great biography of the saint called Bakhita from Slave to Saint that talks about her journey, that is available in the University of St. Thomas libraries and will be quickly returned after this speech. And Janet McKenzie has a book called Holiness and the Feminine Spirit that includes icons of many of the women of the church, including Saint Josephine. And if I can find this picture, I'll show it to you. Has an image that looks very similar to our icon today and tells the story of the icons and the images made to Saint Josephine and other holy women of the church. So at this time, I'm happy to take your questions. Is Professor Sisk moderating or we're just, okay. Yes, Dean Vischer.
I know you teach about human trafficking and one reason we venerate saints is as sources of hope. What, if anything, gives you hope among all the bleakness in the current state of human trafficking?
Well, my students, I would say, is one of my great sources of hope. I mean, we have had so many people sign up for this course in the last couple of years, and we graduated our first alum who's now prosecuting human trafficking full time in southern Minnesota. And I'm really proud of Tomas and all the students who remind me, as Professor Shea promised they would, that the youth, I don't like to think of myself as middle-aged, but my doctor assures me that I am now, that the youth are really where we're looking for hope and for a belief that these struggles against injustice will continue. And so part of why I said what I said today is, I know it can be tiring. I know it can be exhausting. And I know that the last 2 years have been really hard. Hard is not even the right word, beyond anyone's imagination of what so many of you came to law school for. But I do believe that you're making a difference. And I believe that what I have seen in the last 20 years about the world beyond the church, awakening to the evil of human trafficking and the exploitation of the human body and the dignity of the human body all point back to a very Catholic, very Christian understanding of life created in the image of God. Yes, ma'am.
So the clinics at St. Thomas Law represent a survivor of human trafficking. Is eligible for both a trafficking visa and asylum. And this individual, when we talk to them about the benefits of getting a T visa, this individual it absolutely refuses to apply for a T visa, because applying for a T visa would require them to admit that their trafficker trafficked them and would require some law enforcement engagement. And our client is profoundly grateful to this individual for getting them to the United States and for the life that she has today.
Mhm.
And so she's willing to go the much more complex, risky route of asylum, which comes with many less benefits, to avoid having to prosecute the person that she's grateful to. And it's obviously not up to me to have an opinion on what this person desires to do, but it has been my experience in talking to survivors of trafficking that when they, that an emotional bond often forms, right, with their trafficker. And the thing that I struggle with in St. Bakhita's story, which you touched on, is I don't know how to get from recognition of the wickedness and the darkness. I don't know how to get from there to forgiveness without glossing over the depth of wickedness. And I find myself often, when I'm like ruminating about injustice or a really, really cruel, evil person or system, and that's ruminating in my head, the way that I get to the other side is remind myself that that person is also a child of God and is a sick person and has experienced harm. And like, that's what helps liberate me. But I find myself then subsequently dismissing how terrible trafficking or wickedness was. And so I guess like my question is, how do you hold both? Like, how do you get from like an awareness of injustice to forgiveness and like your own liberation without dismissing or without glossing over just how bad like that stuff is. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think it's the hardest part of St. Josephine's story. And in fact, when the first time I heard this quote about her attitude towards her captors, was sent to me actually by my good friend who is the general counsel of Knights in Columbus. And my first thought was, John, you are so Catholic. And I am not going to include this quote in my speech. It is not empowering. I'm afraid of how it could be taken out of context. I'm concerned that people think being a Christian means you just forget. But when I read more about her story, to sort of go back to that quote, which I think, is part of what is concerning you, she wasn't saying that what they did to her was right. I mean, quite the opposite. She talked about it as an evil, and part of the reason she became such an influence in the town is because she could clearly see evil, but she understood the true sources of evil is Satan, who works his way through human beings, right? So she could see the value of even that soul that had oppressed her without excusing what they had done. And so I think forgiveness is the hardest thing that Jesus asks us to do. I think it's the hardest part of being a Christian, because everything within you just humanly wants to hold on to it. But I would say, who gave us the law? Where did that start with humanity? It started with God and Moses, and the origin of rules by which we engage. And so the fact that someone is held accountable under the law doesn't mean that you can't see their worth as a human being, but still force them to face the legal consequences in this life of the action that they've done. And I've heard stories from women again and again, and men, who I think have just, God has given a much greater grace than he's given to me, who are able to separate what is required under the law and their duty in some ways even to protect future victims from someone who, if not held accountable, could be out again to exploit people, and yet to see their worth. I think one of the most powerful stories of a woman who was trafficked is that of Joyce Myers, an evangelical Christian, was raped and abused by her father weekly, starting from the time she was about 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old, and then used by other men to whom her father gave her. And she said that what it did to her life and the toxicity that it created in her, being unable to forgive him, and being unable to even speak about what he did, was almost as bad as the physical torture. And so she finally, by the grace of God, was not only able to forgive him, but to confront him with what he had done, to hold him accountable under the law, and then to speak to him about Jesus and baptize him in his 80s as he repented for the wrong that he had done and accepted Christ as his savior. But again, I say this is a hard part of the story of Saint Josephine, but this is why she's a saint and I'm not. Because this is what God calls us to, this level of forgiveness and the ability, again, I think in the spirit of the Catholic Church, to see the dignity of every human life while still understanding that we hold people accountable for their actions. I hope that your client gets the help that she needs, and I hope that she seeks the T visa. And there's an organization in the Twin Cities called Breaking Free, and I'd love to tell you more about that. That is one of the most remarkable organizations that I have ever worked with, that did a lot to help us in the U.S. Attorney's Office get our human trafficking prosecutions off the ground, but also provide help for victims. And it has always been led by survivors. And so I'd love to put your client in touch with Breaking Free if that could provide some practical help. The current president of Breaking Free is a very good friend of mine who speaks every year to my human trafficking course and tells in no unvarnished terms about her life, the abuse that she suffered, but also the power of God to change her life. And now she's turned her story around and she's helping other women and men who were formerly trapped in slavery. Thank you. Yes, Father.
Thank you for an incredibly challenging presentation.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. You talked about Minnesota itself being particularly vulnerable in the current circumstances, the border, the airports, the immigrant population, the dynamics. Are there a couple of areas currently that would be good for us to know in terms of like policy advocacy in shifting things, whether it's in hospital ERs or the hotel industry or anything kind of tactically that's on the front burner?
Right. I'll give you three, because I'm a preacher's kid and I think in lists and sort of major points. One, what I worry most as someone with so many, what I worry about most as someone with a lot of young people in my life is what's happening online, especially with children. And when we think about how many children are being trafficked in Minnesota and are being enslaved through the internet, I really urge parents, churches, community organizations to look at the Department of Justice's program called Project Safe Childhood that educates parents on what you need to know about what your children are looking at, and to have ground rules about what they're allowed to look at, and how you're supervising them in that way. But I think child exploitation is the next really serious aspect of human trafficking that we have to focus on far more intensely than we have, particularly in Minnesota. Secondly, I would say that we do have, because of the prosperity of the Twin Cities, we have this image that, you know, we're all good Catholics and Northern European Lutherans and bad things don't happen here. And in fact, every time there's a major international event in the Twin Cities, the Super Bowl, the Final Four, major, every time that happens, we see the numbers spike in human trafficking. And it's not, it's the people who are seeking this out come from all walks of life. Some of them are very privileged. Some of them are very wealthy. Some of them are very powerful. And so an awareness around what is happening every time those events happen. There are organizations like Breaking Free and law enforcement that are actively seeking citizen involvement every time we have those kinds of events. And so many ways in which you can volunteer to help around those events. And third, I would say, just be aware of the signs that someone like Saint Josephine has been so blinded to who they are, they don't even remember their own name. When I think about one of the more famous victims of human trafficking, Elizabeth Smart, who was brainwashed by her captors into forgetting her name, into thinking that she was a wife instead of an abused sex slave, and who didn't realize when she first encountered someone who was trying to rescue her, that she needed to be taken out of that situation. And thank God she did eventually sort of wake up to the danger and was freed. But she talks very movingly about what it was like for almost a year to be in that position. Just understand that this is happening all around us. It's happening in the suburbs of Minneapolis. It's happening in residential neighborhoods. It's happening with teenage kids in high schools in Woodbury, that we have this sort of caricature in our mind of this evil slavery that was eradicated by President Lincoln or the Civil War 150 years ago. And that's not true. And so to the extent that you can be an active, citizen, have your eyes open for signs of danger. Look on the DOJ website or Breaking Free's website for signs that someone is being trafficked. And then don't be afraid to speak up, because it's how people like Elizabeth Smart were rescued. Just a citizen intervening after law enforcement had virtually given up. We all have something that we can do to bring an end to this. Thanks so much for coming, and